Joe Biden has now dashed hopes of a post-Brexit transatlantic trade deal, with the UK of course, as he looks to bolster US industry as part of his bid for re-election. Brexit, as a reminder, is the term used to describe the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union. It was a complex and controversial process that began in 2016 with a referendum in which the British people that voted on the day voted to leave the EU. The UK had been a member of the EU since 1973, but there had always been a strong current of Euroscepticism within the country. This was due to a number of factors, including concerns about the loss of sovereignty, the perceived negative impact of EU membership on the UK economy, and a feeling that the EU was not democratic enough, which was all wrong. In the run-up to the 2016 referendum, the two main campaigns were the Vote Leave campaign, which argued that the UK would be better off outside the EU, and the Remain campaign, which argued that the UK would be worse off outside the EU. We now know who was right. The referendum was held on June 23rd in 2016. The turnout was high, with 72% of eligible voters casting their ballots. The Leave campaign won with 51.9% of the vote, while the Remain campaign won 48.1% of the vote. Following the referendum, the UK government began negotiations with the EU to agree the terms of its withdrawal. These negotiations were complex and protracted, and they were often acrimonious. The main sticking points were the future of the Irish border, fishing rights, and the financial settlement that the UK would pay to the EU. After 18 months of negotiations, the UK and the EU reached a withdrawal agreement on November 24th in 2018. The withdrawal agreement set out the terms of the UK's departure from the EU, including the date of withdrawal, which was the January 31st in 2020, the future of the Irish border, and the financial settlement. The withdrawal agreement provided for a transition period of up to 2 years after the date of withdrawal, and during the transition period, the UK remained bound by EU law and continued to participate in the single market and the customs union. This was done to allow for a smooth transition to the UK's new relationship with the EU. The UK and the EU also agreed a framework for their future relationship, and this framework covered a wide range of issues, including trade, security, and cooperation on scientific research to a certain extent. However, the details of the future relationship had to be negotiated, and the transition period came to an end on December 31st in 2020, and this meant that the UK was fully independent of the EU from that date onwards. The UK has since negotiated a free trade agreement with the EU, that's the TCA, but this agreement does not give the EU as much access to the EU market as it had before Brexit. It's still too early to say, of course, what the long-term impact of Brexit will be on the UK economy. However, there is quite some evidence that the UK economy is performing worse than it was before the referendum. For example, GDP growth has been weaker, and unemployment is another topic, and especially shortfall of workers. Brexit also had a significant impact on the UK's political landscape. The country is more divided than it has been for decades, and there is no clear consensus on the future of the UK's relationship with the EU. And so Brexit is a complex and controversial issue that will continue to have a significant impact on the UK for many years to come. Also the promises that were made. And now the post-Brexit talks between the USA and the UK that were set to start in October were abandoned over opposition from members of Mr. Biden's Democratic Party in the US Senate. That was reported by several media. And there was also a failure to agree on how big such a deal should be. But ministers have not given up, according to Whitehall sources speaking to the Daily Telegraph, who say the agreement could be revived under a second Donald Trump administration following the US election in November. The negotiations over a post-Brexit trade agreement have, at least in theory, been ongoing since October 16th in 2018, when then President Trump's trade envoy Robert Lighthizer sent notification to Congress of the administration's intent to open talks after the UK exited the European Union in March 2019, which didn't happen at that time. The talks were officially launched at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, but not much progress occurred between then and when Mr. Biden's administration took power following Mr. Trump's ouster in the 2020 presidential election. Since then, London has seen the coronation of a new sovereign and the rise of two other Conservative prime ministers who have failed to gain much movement on any trade deal, and they said they want to save for quiet plans for a foundational agreement that was supposed to kick off in the autumn. But one British and one American source have told media that the negotiations, such as they were, are now off. I don't think we're going to see that re-emerge, said one of the sources. And Politico was one of those talking about this. British exports to the US accounted for 17% of all exports as of June, but reaching a trade deal with London has not been a priority in Washington. Mr. Trump's predecessor, Barack Obama, famously said in the run-up to the 2016 Brexit referendum that the UK would be at the back of the queue for any such deal, were the British people to vote in favour of leaving the European Union. Having done so, British exports lost the favourable terms they received when the UK was part of the EU. And while the lack of progress in talks has been a bone of contention between Number 10 and the White House, the American government has not been eager to enter into any agreements that could undermine Mr. Biden's reputation as a champion of organized labor. Since taking office, the 46th president has made a point of pushing for worker protections in all international trade agreements, but the lack of robust labor standards in an outline for a US-UK proposal that circulated earlier this year raised hackles among Senate Democrats, many of whom are, like Mr. Biden, outspoken allies of the US labor movement. A spokesperson for one such senator, Oregon's Ron Wyden, told Politico that US-UK trade talks should be driven by substance and expressed the senator's view that no trade deal should be announced until one that benefits Americans is achievable. The spokesperson also stressed that the US Congress must have a clear role in approving any future trade agreements, said Mr. Wyden, who believes it is important for the USTR to be significantly more engaged with Congress on any future negotiations. It appears that Mr. Biden's negotiators were quite insistent on including protections for US labor as a condition of any trade deal. Another source briefed on negotiations said that the vibes were quite tough when American and British negotiators last met, with the Americans having doubled down on insisting that London adopt what the source said the US delegation described as worker-centric trade policy. The first source also described the American negotiators as being very focused on labor standards, as well as on environmental issues, and these very worthy things. And according to the Telegraph, a Whitehall source has suggested that a return to the White House by Mr. Trump could help the chances of the long-coveted deal. When an agreement was being drawn up, it was because Trump had said that a trade deal with the UK was a possibility, so a non-Biden White House might be more amenable, the source said. When asked about the abandonment of the trade deal, the Prime Minister's official spokesperson told The Independent that the US remained the UK's biggest trading partner with $310 billion in annual trade. And they said, "We've achieved all of that without a free trade agreement and through the compatibility of our economies, our commitment to open trade, and the strength of our respective industries." There is a focus on reducing those few barriers that remain to uninterrupted trade, and we are creating new opportunities for businesses on both sides of the Atlantic. That is what the Atlantic Declaration is focused on. That's the work that is continuing. Yeah, but that was the biggest problem as well, but the biggest promise of the Brexiteers, and it's still far in a distant future. But if you want to hear more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.